Hi, welcome. Welcome to our first Common Good Canteen session. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here today. I am Laura Gilchrist, and I'm based in Manchester in the United Kingdom, where it is lunchtime for us. It's so great to see so many people here, and particularly welcome if it's quite early in the morning for you. So just to give you a bit of context about myself, I'm Laura. I live in Manchester with my husband and my two children who are 6 and 10. I've been involved with Common Change since it started here in the UK, in the area where I live in Old Trafford, which you may have heard of because it's the basis of where Manchester United are based. And yes, my son does support Manchester United. And I was involved a few years ago with another couple in living in a community house, and have been really interested in all aspects of community ever since then. In my professional life, I work as a leadership coach, working with leaders to support them particularly around their own health and well-being. And it's really, I'm really privileged to be hosting this with Matt Wilson. Just to briefly introduce Matt. Matt and I have known one another for, gosh, I think it must be over 20 years now. We, in my early days of being here in Manchester, we were involved in a church together, and we've kept in touch ever since. Matt is based up in North Shields in the northeast of England. He is the chair of trustees for Common Change UK, and he's also a local councillor. And runs his own business, consulting business up in North Shields. So it's really good to be here with you all. And I'm excited for this topic of sharing life and sharing resources together. So I'm going to hand over to Matt now to say a bit more about what we're going to be doing.
Oh, thanks, Laura. Thanks so much. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you. I see a number of faces on the screen that I recognize, but lots that I don't, which is actually really encouraging because it means that our efforts to sort of make this something of a network of networks seems to have worked. Why are we doing this? Well, I guess there's just something about connection, isn't there? There's something about us feeling a little bit disconnected during this last 12 months. Those of you who like just to, you're gregarious, you like to meet people, you like to have good quality conversations, you like to talk about meaty stuff. And there's just been a kind of a paucity of opportunity to do that. And so we felt it would be a great thing to do, just to try and facilitate conversations between people that are meaningful, and try and recreate some of that atmosphere that sometimes happens. You may have spent some time in a workplace that had a workplace canteen that was busy at lunchtime, had lots of conversations going on. Maybe they weren't always deep and meaningful, but today is absolutely will be. And so we've got Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove joining us to help us to have that kind of a conversation. Welcome, Jonathan. Before we talk to Jonathan, I'm just going to go through a little bit of the etiquette with you. So because we're on Zoom, I'm sure you've probably all done this before, but just to remind you what all the buttons are and all that kind of thing. So if you choose the gallery view, then you get everybody's face, a little bit like University Challenge or that kind of thing. Everybody's stacked up on your screen. There's the chat function. Please do pop a comment in the chat. Tell us where you're dialing in from. So yeah, tell us what part of the country you're in, or indeed what part of the world you're in. We'd love to see that. So please do ping us a comment now. And there's also a reactions button that you can use as well if you want. So I would say give us a thumbs up if you are actually having your lunch right now. Anybody actually having their lunch right now? You can use the reactions button. Anybody having a liquid lunch or just having soup, you can use the applause if you're having soup, or perhaps use the heart if you're having a sandwich. Okay, I can see some claps. I can see some thumbs up. I can't see any hearts. Nobody's having a sandwich. Oh yeah, somebody's having a sandwich. Greg's having a sandwich. Mim's having a sandwich. Right. Okay. Jolly good. I've already had mine, so it was an early start today. Well, what I'd like to do, I suppose, is we want to get introduced to our special guest, Jonathan. We're going to interview him later, but Laura, I'll just probably hand back to you just to get us acquainted with our guest this today. So just in handing over, just to say, I think I have met Jonathan once before. I don't know if you recall this, Jonathan. We have had lunch. I don't know if you know that. And it was in Southall in East London. We had a curry with a bunch of other people, probably about 10 years ago. You're nodding as if you remember, but yeah, I
do recall, yes.
Oh, great stuff.
And I remember I stayed at the Rupper House there in the neighborhood.
Yeah, fantastic. Great stuff. Well, look, Jonathan, you're so welcome. Laura's going to get us a little bit more acquainted with you and ask you a sort of an opening question.
Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to kick us off with thinking a bit, because we're doing this, at least for us here in the UK, over our lunchtime. And, you know, we know that eating meals together and food is really significant in the scriptures. And I don't know about everyone else here, but one of the things that's been particularly challenging over this past year is not being able to share meals with people and build community in that way. And you know, we know that when we look at scripture, you've got so many examples of Jesus just eating with people constantly. It was one of the things that, you know, that strikes me whenever I look at the Gospels. And I know that in my own journey, one of the things that's been really significant is creating spaces where we can eat and meet. And so I'd love to hear, you know, from you, what's been a particularly memorable meal for you, if you were to kind of pick one that you would name?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess even when we don't have the ability to be together, so many of us, we do have our memories. I remember lots of meals here where I live at the Rutabaga House. We have focused on sharing life together around a table. And I think some of my best memories here have been just when I've had the chance to observe people meeting at the table who may not have ever had a chance to meet otherwise. I just think about how food and, you know, eating, passing food, asking for help, eating, makes everyone vulnerable in a beautiful way. And some of my best memories here are around, you know, seeing a local businessman sit across from someone who's homeless, or someone who teaches at the university, you know, sitting across from someone maybe they've driven past on the road dozens of times, but they've never actually met the person, and saying, you know, could you pass the green beans or whatever. I mean, it's the beginning of a kind of leveling, I think, that is so needed in our society. So those are some of my best memories at the table. I'll tell you one quick story. One time we had a guy who was coming through here on a bicycle. He was riding from the state of Virginia in North Carolina all the way to Peru in South America. And he had stopped here on his way, and he was staying with us a couple of days. He had told us about this journey, and he was sharing it with the man across from him, who had lived decades of his life on the streets of our city, and often, you know, rides a bike around town to get where he needs to go. And this man was so moved by hearing what this guy was imagining that he was going to do for the next 6 months, that he stood up in the middle of the dining room and announced to everyone that this guy Lars was going to ride his bike all the way to Peru. And he reaches into his pocket and he says, "All I've got is this $1, but I'm going to give it to you, brother. Hope you have a good journey."
I love that. Yeah.
And I made it to Peru.
He did make it to Peru. Yeah, he sent us a postcard when he got there, and he actually ended up coming back and living with us for several years. So we've told that story many times.
I love that, Jonathan. And I wonder, for those of us that don't know, you know, your context and about Rupper House, if you could just tell us briefly what the setup is that you've got there for people that aren't acquainted.
Well, we live together in a hospitality house. My family, I'm married and we have 3 kids. We live together with others here, and in normal times, we have an evening meal together that's sort of open to the neighborhood. It's been somewhat constricted now for these months of the pandemic and a sort of relative quarantine. But we've actually had a number of meals on our porch with smaller groups of neighbors to try to stay in touch. Our porch has become the place of meeting. You know, we mask up and sit out there and catch up with people.
I love the creativity of that, pivoting to kind of just still build the connections with the community, even in the face of the COVID challenges. Yeah.
Well, the nice thing about living in the American South is that even in the wintertime, you can actually be outside much of the time.
I'm not sure we'd get away with that here. What do you reckon, Matt?
I know it's a challenge many people are facing.
You wouldn't get away with that in the Northeast. No, certainly not. Absolutely perishing. Look, we want to give everybody on the call a chance to get to know one another a little bit as well. And so we're going to put you in breakout rooms for a few minutes just to get introduced to one another. And we're going to give you that same question to ask one another, tell one another, what's a particularly memorable meal that you've had? So just introduce, give your sort of name and where you're from, and then as quickly as you can, just perhaps think of, and here's a memorable meal that I had once upon a time. It may have been a moving occasion, it may have been a funny occasion, it may have been your favorite birthday party, whatever it was, just get introduced to one another for a few minutes, and then we'll come back together. Right, wonderful. Are we all back? I hope you've had fantastic conversations with one another there, and you've learned a little bit about one another, found out what's been going on in different people's worlds. We're going to dive straight back into our conversation with Jonathan now, and find out more of what he's got to say to us on this topic of sharing life and sharing resources. And one of the really interesting things I found when it comes to this idea of sharing is that clearly, you know, there's got to be two sides to that story. There's a giving dimension to it, and there's a receiving dimension to it. I not too long ago was put on the spot and asked to kind of summarize. So what is the message that Jesus has got for us about money and about resources, and how can you summarize that? But I think that perhaps the best way would be through some words that are recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, where he says, freely you have received, freely give. And there just seems to be something in that dynamic of receiving coming before giving. And Jonathan, I know a little bit about your story, and I know that on one occasion you sort of unexpectedly found yourself receiving some hospitality, and it was when it's going back a few years ago now, and you were in a war zone and some kind of accident took place and you needed help from an unexpected source. Can you unpack that story for us? I'd love to hear it in more detail.
Yeah, this hospitality house where I live is called Rutabaga House, and it's named after a village in the western Anbar province of Iraq called Rutba. We were there in 2003 when the United States, in partnership with the UK, was waging an offensive against the people of Iraq. And we were there with a group called the Christian Peacemaker Teams. And we were traveling on a road that had been under bombardment for a couple of weeks at that point. And one of the cars that we were traveling in hit a piece of shrapnel on the road. It careened into a ditch, and the folks who were in that car were pretty seriously injured. A couple split their heads open, and one guy broke his shoulder. And they stumbled out on the side of this road in the middle of a desert, in the middle of the war, trying to figure out what to do. And a car of Iraqis stopped and took them into their car and drove them into this town of Rutba, where they found a doctor who said, 3 days ago, your country bombed our hospital, but we will take care of you. And he saved their lives. By the time we got back, he had patched them up, and we were able to get them into the cars that we had left and travel on to Jordan, where we took one of them who was most seriously injured to a hospital. But when we came back to the States that spring of 2003, we told that story. And the more I told it as someone raised on the Bible, the more I realized that it was the Good Samaritan story, you know, that story Jesus tells about the one who's supposed to be our enemy, the Samaritan, stops by the roadside and picks up the person and pays for their medical care. And that for us was receiving hospitality that really showed us what God's love looks like. Jesus ends that story by saying, "Go and do likewise." You know, we're called to imitate that hospitality that we receive. And so we named this hospitality house after the folks there, and have tried to live into what we received from them, and to continue to learn in this conversation of give and take. I mean, I think this dynamic that you're talking about is an ongoing thing, you know, to realize that we live in this sort of exchange between always being guest and host, and figuring out you know, how God meets us in the midst of that. I think is a good bit of what the experience of sharing has been about for us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. What an incredible story to hear from you, and just speak so much of that generosity and grace. And I'm really curious to learn more about the impact that had for you in terms of how you then sought to shape the Rupper community and do life together. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, you know, some years later, a group went back to Rutaba to find the people who had taken care of us. And my wife, Leah, and I were going to be part of that trip, but it got delayed, and it ended up happening right when our daughter was being born. So we didn't go. But the folks who did go back, they found two of the people who had helped our friends there. All of the people who had been injured in that car were on the group that went back. And when they found them, I remember they told us, they said, you know, we were in this group that you saved, and we've come back. And they said, before they could even say anything else, the people said, "Oh, did you leave something here? You know, do we need to help you find something?" They said, no, we just wanted to thank you." And I was fascinated. They told us that they said to them, "Well, we didn't really do anything exceptional." They said, it's actually the law." And they said, "What do you mean it's the law?" And they said, "Well, in the desert, the law is hospitality, because when you live in a place like this, if you come across someone who's in need in a desert and you don't take care of them, they will die." And they said, "We've always been taught it's the law that if you come across someone who is in real need, you have to give them water, you have to give them food, you have to give them medical attention. That's the law of the desert."
That's absolutely fascinating, because I mean, what that says to me is certainly the way that we might understand the scarcity narrative that we sometimes hear in the West is that in times of scarcity, grab, because you must. If you don't grab for yourself, there won't be enough to go around. But you're suggesting there that in an environment of scarcity, actually the opposite is true.
Yeah, that's right. And I thought about that when you asked sort of how we've been shaped by this experience, because in so many ways, I feel like what we have learned in this place is that hospitality and sharing is actually the law, or at least the practice, the accepted practice, the assumed practice of most poor people. And it's certainly been the assumed practice of the neighborhood that we've been in. So we came here wanting to be a house of hospitality. And I feel like in so many ways, we've learned hospitality from our neighbors. One of the and having a space with rooms available, one of the most often requested needs that we've had is people coming home from prison, who need a place to stay. And, you know, it's always a conversation with those who are living in our household, whether we have space or just capacity to welcome someone new. And I'll tell you, it's been 18 years now, we've often said no. And, you know, because the number of rooms we have, or you know, mental health of those of us who are here, we just have felt like we couldn't say yes to a particular request. And it's often struck me that when we say no to what, you know, the people come home anyway, and you watch who does welcome them. And it's often been the case that we've seen neighbors welcome people into their homes who have far less resources than we do. And I think it's been a constant education to me of how this practice of sharing and hospitality is something that, you know, those who have been pushed to the edges and the margins and have had the least resources are often the best gifted at practicing. I sometimes feel like in terms of practicing God's economy, you know, the neighbor up the street who holds court on her porch regularly, I feel like she is better suited, you know, to manage the budget of the state that I live in or the nation that I live in than all of these people with MBAs who actually do it. I mean, if this woman had access to the resources they have, she could feed everybody 6 times over. I guarantee it, because I've seen what she does with the resources she does have.
Remarkable. Yeah. Yeah. Laura, we were talking earlier, and I guess there's something there about the pattern of life that we find ourselves living, isn't there? Is that something that you might want to comment on?
Yeah, I think, you know, I know that when we shared a house with another couple, and we had, you know, you described your monthly neighborhood meals to open up the space for people, and it was quite easy to do that in a way because there were 4 adults and we could open up the space. I'm really curious to hear, you know, for those of us that are now, you know, living maybe more conventionally in families or couples or even individuals, how can we kind of create that attitude of generosity and sharing that you kind of sound like you inhabit within Rupper House? What sort of thoughts do you have for those of us that maybe have those more typical setups in our lives?
Well, I think the number one thing that we've had to learn, and that we all have to in our various situations, is that being interrupted can be an invitation. I mean, I think so much of the normal practice of our conventional Western lives insulates us from the need that's around us. This is what has made the extreme inequality that we live within possible, is that we are relationally insulated from the incredible disparity that's been normalized in our societies. And so simply opening ourselves to the interruptions in ways that see them as invitations. That's how I hear Jesus. You know, Jesus has promised to show up in those who are hungry, in those who need shelter, in those who are incarcerated. It's not, I don't think it's so much an ethical challenge, you know, will you sort of be the good person or be the good Christian and do these things, but rather will you receive the invitation to know Jesus in the way that Jesus is coming to us, to know truth and love and mercy in the interruptions that come to us in life. And it doesn't matter whether you're living, you know, a job where you have an apartment and, you know, you go back and forth to work on your own, or you're in a family, or you're in some sort of multi-generational family, or you're living in co-housing, or, you know, whatever your living situation, it will be interrupted by the needs of real people. And if we see those interruptions as invitations instead of as something that we have to defend ourselves against, I think it becomes an opportunity to, to have a conversation. Who knows where it leads? I'm not saying that that there's any sort of clear path toward a different way of being, but I think simply opening ourselves to the interruption is one step we can make.
Yeah. Jonathan, as I hear you describing that, yeah, oh, sorry, Laura, for jumping in. I just listening to you there. It sounds to me as if you're describing time as a resource that we can own too tightly. I wanted to ask you some questions about about ownership and about possessions and that sort of thing. But actually, hearing you speak just then, I kind of want to flip that question a little bit and say perhaps is time the one commodity that we hold on to more tightly than anything else these days? And maybe what you just described to us is having a radical approach to our commodity of time. Would that be an accurate sort of reflection of what you've been saying?
It may be our time. And I think often it may be simply our expectations. We in Western culture we've become such planners. We all have a plan, and we've come to believe that that in some ways sort of efficiently executing a plan is the pinnacle of a life well lived. And when I read the Gospels, I often think, well, if Jesus did have a plan, it sure got screwed up a lot. He's going one way, and somebody, grabs him by the hem of his jacket and pulls him another way, and he's going to try to help his friend when he's dying, and he gets there and his friend's been in the grave 2 days. I mean, the guy's late. This is a terribly executed plan. He comes to save the world and he ends up getting killed. I mean, this is in some ways, I think Jesus's life is a witness to us that that living a life that's present to who shows up in front of us seems to be a higher priority for God and human flesh than carrying out some plan. And maybe we have something to learn from that. I think it's certainly about time. It can also be about our resources. It can be about our relationships.
What you've been sharing, Jonathan, really reminds me of a great quote that I read from Henry Nouwen, who's the academic theologian and also lived in community. And he said, and I'm probably going to paraphrase here, but he said something like, I've spent my whole life feeling frustrated because I was being interrupted from doing my life's work. Mm-hmm. And then I realized that the interruptions were my life's work. And it really kind of struck me that it resonates with what you've just shared, that maybe the interruptions are where we're supposed to be, where we're called to be. And I find that quite personally challenging right now in my own context of we're in a full lockdown here in the UK. I've got 2 children who are both needing support with home learning, and I find myself frustrated because I'm being interrupted with my work, and then flipping that 180, maybe that is my work.
Yeah. Well, we've all been interrupted, haven't we?
Yeah.
The world has been interrupted. And I think it's a great invitation for us to consider what it's revealing to us. It's striking to me here in the US, and I think this is much the case in at least in the wealthy countries of the world, that this pandemic has revealed the fissures in our society all the more clearly, because while we've had a sort of economic crisis that's gone along with shutting down so much, the richest people in our society have actually gotten richer. The people who own the order by mail businesses, and many of us who are able to work from home and order what we need by mail, Um, but the people who do the service work, you know, the people who have who've not been able to stay home, have not only borne the weight of this disease in terms of contracting it and passing it to their family members, but have also borne the economic burden. And in the States, we're talking about the so-called K-shaped recovery. You know, that it's for rich people, the economy has recovered, while at the same time it's a nosedive for low-income people. Well, you know, that's the interruption that we've experienced. And if it has helped us to see more clearly that inequality is really the norm in our society, then I think it's an invitation to all of us to ask what we can do to, you know, that we've been interrupted is an invitation to interrupt the norms of this system that we all participate in, that is creating a growing inequality for so many people.
Speaking of interruptions, I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt, because we wanted to give people a chance to chew over what Jonathan's been saying with one another. And so we had planned to give you quite a meaty chunk of time to talk about this, but we're going to go quickly to breakout rooms, and just want to give you the opportunity to spend 5 minutes talking with one another about your reflections on what Jonathan has been saying. She has Welcome back. I should probably say at this point that I can take neither credit nor blame for the soundtrack. But I do want to call out, actually, while I've got the chance, before the end, I want to say a big thank you before we get to the end and I forget, to Darren and Megan. Darren has interjected a couple of times. His wife Megan is on the call as well. They're in California and got up at 4 a.m. to help us do this today. So yeah, there we go. Let's hear it for Darren and Megan. So we want to hear your questions that have emerged from your conversations in the groups there. And what I'd like to do as we go into that is, if you could just furiously type, just get those questions in the chat. Meanwhile, we did have a really great question that just popped up a moment ago, which was from Lydia. And so I'm going to put that question now to Jonathan. And meanwhile, the rest of you can be adding your questions into the chat, and Laura will pick the next question. So this question, Jonathan, is from Lydia, and it's: how do we care for people who we've committed specific time to, and then balance with those interruptions from people in need, which is so important? She's been pondering that recently. So I guess, yeah, there's a kind of a commitment of time, but then, you know, life can get interrupted, and we don't want those people that I guess we've made a commitment to be robbed of that that share of our time that they deserve and expect.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think there's any clear answer to this, but I would say that I've learned that one of the greatest gifts any of us can give to anyone, one of the clearest signs that someone is important to you, is to tell them, you're important enough to me that you can interrupt me. I mean, I think that's it's a critical message for parents to give to their children, right? No matter what I'm doing, if you call, I'm going to answer, you know. But I think that's part of what opening ourselves to interruption by you know, people who may be quote unquote in need is about. It's about saying that that we don't live in this sort of we don't live in this world of hierarchy where there's, you know, people up here who matter at this level and people here who matter at this level. It's a way of trying to flatten that out. But it doesn't mean that we don't have to have boundaries and respect commitment. And I guess the other thing that comes to mind is that, you know, sometimes a way to love someone and to genuinely open ourselves to them is to invite them into a circle that includes others, right? So sometimes when I'm not available, I tell someone, you matter enough to me that I'm going to call this friend, I'm going to call, this person and ask them if they might be able to be with you right now, because I can't. And I think that's part of what it means to live in community and to care as a community for those around us.
Yeah, thank you. Laura, do we have another question?
I thought this was an interesting one from Andy. Are some interruptions get behind me Satan moments? Which is an interesting question. I think what Andy's getting at there is, I'm assuming, sort of distractions or things that we need to kind of hold a boundary against. What's your view on that, Jonathan? I guess it's sort of slightly playing devil's advocate there in that question.
Oh, yeah. But the story that's referenced, of course, is the story of the temptation in the wilderness. And I think often about how those temptations that Jesus first faces in the desert, and then that come in a concrete form through Peter, who I guess is immediately told in the gospel text, get behind me. In all of those cases, whether it's Jesus alone facing them sort of in the inner life, or them being manifested in those around, it's a question of whether we're going to take the world's offer of power, the world's offer of sort of economic opportunity, and the world's offer of sort of religious significance. I think those things come again and again. And I see that as a way of saying no to the ways that we're tempted to sort of compromise the good way, God's way, for these other ways that seem like they may be more efficient or more effective, or a quicker way to get toward the ends that we hope for. So of course there are, interruptions that could fall into that category, but I think it's an issue of discernment that's about trying to stay within the center of what we've committed ourselves to, and what we've committed to with the community of people that we're part of.
Great stuff. I'm going to jump in with one final question. This is a question that Anna has asked, and it's a question about, as we come out of the pandemic and we begin to re-engage with people, how to do that in sort of sensitive ways, mindful that some people may potentially be quite fragile. I imagine there are some people on this call who are going to rush out there and want to kind of embrace everybody that they've not seen, and that could be potentially overwhelming. Not that Anna would ever do that, but there might be some people. And so, what's the sort of vibe? Would you recommend that we just kind of rush into the streets and we sort of have a great big party? Is that what you're going to do? Or are we going to be actually emerging a little bit more quietly and sensitively?
And Anna, you have anything that you want to add to that?
I guess it was just appreciating the legacy, if not the damage, that's been done by this enforced isolation, enforced houseboundness, and what the church and what us as people who love one another can do to be mindful and sensitive to the impact that it's been kind of retreating from the world, and that we might re-enter it, different people, and in what ways is the Lord calling us to get alongside people in a slightly different way?
I think it's a really great question. Our lives have been interrupted, and we've also, been in this long enough that we've developed new patterns and practices. And I think even the way that we think about the new ways of being is important in terms of how we will be able to transition and adjust after this time is over. In many church circles here, I think it's been difficult for people to understand their physical distancing from other people as a way of loving those people, right? As a way of loving one another. But but it seems to be that's an important way to understand it. We aren't staying away from one another to keep ourselves safe. It's not this sort of like self-protectionism. I think the sort of best intersection of love of neighbor with, public health advice is to say that the only way to keep this virus from, spreading so quickly that it, not only kills people but overwhelms our health systems and other things, is to try to prevent the spread through this physical distancing. And so, so understanding the way we've reconfigured our life as a way of loving neighbors, I think is important if we're going to re-engage in ways that are loving. And I think you're absolutely right that there are going to be challenges to that. I mean, this has, I suspect, when we do begin to get back together, and again, my reading of public health is that it's not going to happen all at once, right? We're going to have a sort of graduated reintroduction to things, or we'll see, virus spikes and this sort of stuff that could drive us back into more isolation. But as we move back into that, I do think we'll probably notice that some people's social skills have been diminished by a year of not being together. And I think reading one another and trying to bear with one another in the midst of that is going to be incredibly important.
Some great points there, Jonathan, and a great question. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, so much for today, for your time, for giving us such incredibly rich food for thought. And, we could talk all afternoon around this. It's just been such a pleasure to mine your wisdom and hear a bit about some of your experiences and your stories. And I'm also mindful of people's time, and we did commit to the hour, so we're going to need to start wrapping up. I know that there'll be, from this, dinner time conversations that are sparked moving forwards, and this is the first of 3 sessions that we are running. The next being on, I'll let Matt talk about that in a moment actually, but before I hand over to Matt to talk about the next one, I just want to let you all know about a fantastic resource that Matt has produced, which is the result of his postgraduate study. And it's a book with a downloadable workbook with a resource that can be used in small groups as a kind of conversation starter around how do we, in our own lives, embody this concept of generosity, of what's mine is yours. And it's actually, that's the title of it, Mine or Ours. And we'll put the link to that downloadable book into the chat. I wonder if Megan or Darren would kindly do that now, so that anyone that wants to access that can copy the link and make a copy of it to take away.
Real.
I can hand over to you, Laura. Matt, now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us for our first Common Good Canteen. So we have another one, 12:30 on the 24th of February. So again, that's a Wednesday lunchtime. We've got Natalie Williams with us next time. Natalie has written a number of books on how we can respond to poverty in our communities. And we particularly want to have a conversation with her. She wrote this great book, The Myth of the Undeserving Poor. And so we want to have a conversation about that myth that goes on in the kind of conversations that we have with other people. And it interferes with our willingness to be generous. Is this kind of question around, does somebody really deserve generosity? And we want to really explore that with Natalie next month. And then the month after, we've got Mike Royal joining us, and we're going to have a conversation with Mike on the 24th of March about power and privilege and how that might affect our lives as we seek to live them generously and openly in our communities. So thanks so much to you all for joining. Yes, get on the website. You can book for next month. The link is already open, but thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Jonathan, Darren and Megan, and everyone else who's joined.
Thank you all. Take care.
Okay.
Bye, folks.
Bye.